Hello, friends. David Vos here. Beautiful day here in Oklahoma. As you can see, it's just beautiful. Got a very, very amazing program for us today. And I guarantee it's going to be a good one. I think every day that each video just gets better. Because I really do think, you got to start with basic foundational knowledge in order to understand the higher concepts. So that's what we've been doing, and we've been learning as we go. But I don't think we could have ever gotten to some of the things that we're about to start learning if we hadn't gone through the preliminary understandings. A lot of the stuff that we've talked about in the past is stuff that the world just doesn't know. Absolutely doesn't know. A lot of times I've done quite a few videos on diet. As you'll probably remember, I was a vegetarian for 11 years. And I really thought that was the right way to go. I even did videos about being a vegetarian. And then one day I got very sick and I had to re-examine what I was teaching. And I found clear evidence that in the New Testament, Jesus ate fish. We know that he ate fish. There's no record of Jesus eating anything but fish. He fed his disciples bread and fish. And something else, which we're going to talk about. He gave them honey, and their eyes were opened. It's some kind of strange honey. Well, we're going to prove what that honey was. But he definitely gave them fish. Now, even if you say, well, it's symbolic, Dave. He didn't really give them fish. That symbolizes something. Well, you got to take the Bible literally in some cases. I mean, when Jesus says that eggs are a perfect food, and then you go and look up how perfect eggs really are. And we're going to talk about why they're so perfect for your diet. The cholesterol, the omega-3 in the egg is so important. And that's some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today. The honey, the eggs, the fish, and diet. But the Apostle Paul was very clear that there were those in the first century that were vegetarians. Some of the Essenes were vegetarians. Some of the followers of John the Baptist. We can read about that in history. And there were many in the Apostle Paul's day, in Jesus' day, there were many Jews that were Pharisees and Sadducees and scribes and so forth. Most of them certainly believed in eating meat because, they followed the laws of Moses, which prescribed the meats that were clean and unclean. And they didn't eat pork, but they definitely had sheep and lamb. Of course, in order to celebrate the Passover and many of the celebrations, if you were Jewish, you had to eat meat. Excuse me. And, boy, I sat here for a few minutes and didn't hear any cars. And I turned this camera on and it's just one car after another like a funeral out there. Hopefully that'll go away in a second, friends. And noisy cars, too. They don't got mufflers, every one of them. But, we want to understand whether or not vegetarianism is good for you or not. Now, one thing we've noticed is the Apostle Paul says that those who eat vegetables are weak. And I don't think he meant that, it was wrong to care about animals, of course, or anything. But he was saying that we had to have faith. And man, oh man, the cars just keep going and going. I think there must be a funeral. It's kind of annoying. Sorry about that, friends. Kind of distracting my thinking process. But, well, we got to get all this straight. I think what the Apostle Paul part of what the Apostle Paul was talking about, of course, in one verse, he mentions this meat eating and vegetarianism in 2 different chapters of the Bible in the New Testament. One of them was more about eating things offered to idols. And they would bring up their food, their meat, to be sacrificed to an idol. And so there were a lot of the Christians, early Christians, that were using that as an excuse to be vegetarian, because they were saying, well, you go to the meat market, and a lot of the meat that's in the market was something that was offered to a demon or a false god or idolatry or some pagan religion. And so, for their own conscience, they wouldn't eat it. Now, the Apostle Paul says, don't have a weak conscience. It's okay to eat meat. And so, if you're afraid to eat meat just because, somebody else may have had some false beliefs, you go to the market, he says, take no thought for your conscience. Because you don't know if, perchance something in the market, you might have got the wrong hunk of meat, maybe this meat had been already, because I guess they would sacrifice part of the animal, and what was left over, they didn't need it. They'd just go and make some money in the market. Well, you didn't know which meat was which, and you didn't ask questions. Paul says, don't worry about it. But if somebody comes up to you and they say, hey, this was sacrificed to Satan, that's a satanic sacrifice you're eating there, buddy. Then he said, oh, okay, well then don't eat it, but not for your own conscience, for theirs, because you don't want to stumble anybody. So that's what he was talking about there. But there is another verse in the Bible where he talks primarily what appears to be about vegetarianism. And he seems to indicate that there isn't any prohibition, even in that place that we just talked about. Regardless of whether it was meat sacrificed to an idol, Paul was clearly saying that it was okay to eat meat. Now, he didn't say it was better not to eat meat or better to eat meat or anything like that. But what we're going to find is that it is better to eat meat in this particular age that we're living in. We're going to prove this specifically. Actually, I know some of you might be thinking, oh, I don't want to hear a video about diet or vegetarianism day. That's just, I want to hear more about some of the other stuff you're talking about. Well, stay tuned, because this isn't just about diet, but it's the kind of preliminary to some very important things that we're going to get into. Just blow your mind. We're getting into cannabis and weeds and herbs and specific nutrients that we're not getting in our diet, which is the reason that we're unhappy. And boy, this is really going to get interesting, so stay tuned. You would be surprised what's really in the Bible. The stuff that you'd find in there if you look it up, if you figure it out, if you look at the actual Greek and Hebrew and kind of harmonize the scriptures. So we know that Jesus fed them fish. We know that scientifically, we know this is the reason that I went back to eating meat. I got very sick. I know some other people, some people on the internet that are vegetarians. They get really, really thin and they're very sick. And so I think this is an important video that we need to understand from that perspective, but also because of cannabis is a very important subject that we're talking about in some of our videos. But I want to go beyond cannabis and the herbs that are for the healing of the nations, because I got some information I just can't wait to share with you. But I know sometimes I beat around the bush, somebody said. Well, all right, let's try to not do that anymore. Let's start off, let's go to Genesis and chapter 1. Now, as you know, there's Genesis 1, there's Genesis 2. Genesis 1, it says, in the beginning, Elohim, God, and that's plural, created the heavens and the earth. So that's our Father in heaven and his spiritual creation. And he creates Adim, male and female, created he them. He makes, in 6 days, he creates the whole world. The second chapter is Yahweh. It introduces Yahweh. And this is an entirely different creation story. In fact, it's not even about creation. It's about forming. It's a completely different word. And so he formed Adam from the dust of the ground. But the whole sequence of creating or forming, in this case, is completely out of order. And there's various reasons why we know that that cannot be the same creation account, just with different words and different gods and different order and all of that. If that's not enough, there's various proofs. And of course, in the second chapter, we've got some different things going on. We've got this God, well, first of all, he gets angry and starts cursing the ground and everything. And we know that's not our Father in heaven. So we go back to Genesis chapter 1, and Elohim creates the world. And in Genesis 1, I think 26, he says he makes man. And he says, I want you to have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, and the animals on the earth. Now, that word in the Hebrew is rada. And it's an interesting word because it really doesn't mean to rule or dominate. They translate it, you will have dominion. And I've said that many times. We're supposed to have dominion over the earth. But I want to clarify the exact meaning of that word in this video because it's very important that we understand what kind of dominion. Because a lot of people think it means that, well, we're just supposed to go out there and rule over them like we're, their owner. And that's not what the word means. Now, the word in the second creation, I think in chapter 3 of Genesis, where it says that Adam was to rule over Eve, or have dominion over, it says, he shall have dominion over thee because of, her sin. And this Yahweh was very angry with her. And he cursed her, and he cursed Adam, and he cursed the ground, and he says, thorns and thistles, it shall grow for thee. That's something we're going to come back to, which is the reason we have to eat meat. Because the earth and the herbs aren't producing. And we're going to find that in the scriptures as to why the condition of the world. I mean, there's prophecies about one day, the thorns and the plants that are now cursed will blossom as the rose. And they will be healed. And the waters shall be healed. And we find this in the book of Isaiah in different chapters. But because of chapter 2 and 3 of Genesis, we find this Yahweh puts everything into this carnal form and makes these commandments and demands that we don't partake of knowledge so that we could become like him. And Adam and Eve partake of this carnal fruit, and their eyes are opened, and they have the first death, which is a spiritual death. They didn't physically die. They just spiritually died. The Bible in the New Testament makes it clear that we've got to interpret all of this by saying, well, there's a second death, a first death, and a second death, and then there's a first resurrection and a second resurrection. So this tells us that we've got to pay close attention to the book of Genesis in every detail and certain words, because there's little hidden meanings all throughout it. So, because, if you didn't pay attention to the New Testament and some of the interpretations, you wouldn't know what kind of death Adam and Eve had, right? And we find the Apostle Paul saying that which is made alive cannot be made alive unless first it dies. And then we find out that Jesus is actually offering us eternal life, just as the serpent did to Adam and Eve, and gives us knowledge. In fact, the whole point of the New Testament is not that Yahweh was correct, but that the serpent was correct, because the New Testament is about this. There's sort of some famous verses like John 3:16 and, to be born again, and hereby this means eternal life. They're taking in knowledge. This is a very important verse of the New Testament. It's a primary doctrinal verse which says this means eternal life. Stop right there. The other God says this means death to take knowledge. Remember? He says if you partake of knowledge, you're going to kill you. You're going to die. You're not going to become like God. Well, Jesus says ye are gods. That scripture cannot be broken. You did partake of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And even that God acknowledged that, look, they become like one of us, knowing good and evil. Look, they might put forth their hand and eat from the tree of life and live forever. Well, see, the same person that offered us the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is the same person that offered us the tree of life. And Jesus is the one that's offering us life. And and besides the tree of life, he offers this river that bubbles up from our innermost being. And we find out this whole Genesis story is a very symbolic thing, because this paradise that the Apostle Paul went to in the third heaven is actually within us. And there's a river of life that shall bubble up from our innermost being, according to Jesus. So we're just basically getting a rounded view of all of this, and this is what this is really talking about. But Genesis 1:26 says, you shall have dominion. Now, nowhere in Genesis chapter 1 does it say we're supposed to eat animals. It just says, I give you food, the fruit of the trees. More or less, garden there means orchard. I'm sure there were vines there, because the Bible talks about this orchard in symbolic ways throughout the Bible. The New Testament talks about it as though it's an orchard, but yet there's still vines there. So in their little garden, they had trees, but there was also flowers and vines. So more or less all the vegetation in the bush and the field and the flowers and the trees. But in some sense, that word garden just means an orchard paradise. And so there were all these fruits. And so he says, well, let's see, Genesis chapter 1 and verse, let's see, 29 says, and God went on to say, I've given you all the vegetation bearing seed, which is on the surface of the earth, and every tree where there is fruit of a tree bearing seed. To you let it serve as food. Well, it's very tricky to translate all this. When it says bearing seed, a lot of people are like real picky, and they're like, oh, we can only eat fruit with seeds, right? It's not what it really means. The word seed there can also be translated offspring. So in other words, a fruit is the offspring of a tree. And so any kind of seed or fruit that is the offspring of a tree, a fruit falls to the ground, it's got seeds in it, and it'll grow another tree. So that's just really what it's talking about. Some trees produce a pulpy fruit, some produce nuts, berries. A lot of them have seeds inside of them. Some of them actually are seeds. Like peaches have big pits. We eat the peach, but they're related to the can't even think of the nut right now, but what is it? Man, I can't even think of they look like peaches. Doggone it. See, not walnuts, not peanuts. Man, anyway, they're like a little, they look like a peach pit inside, but in the peach, it's obviously a pit or a seed. But in this fruit, you peel off the outer part. And I got the word avocado in my mind, and I can't think of this word. Eggcorn. No, it's not eggcorn. I guess it starts with an egg, because that's what I keep thinking. But I'm sure most of you know what I'm talking about. So you pull off the pulpy part that looks similar to the peach, and you actually eat the seed. And we call it a nut. So it doesn't, we have different names for things, but more or less anything grows on a tree. Like if an elm tree, they have, looks like little pods with their little seeds and stuff. Well, that the seeds, many of those kinds of seeds, some of them produce a bean. All of those things are edible. And he says, this is what I give you for food. And he gave it also to the wild beasts of the earth, to every flying creature of the heavens, and to everything that moves upon the earth. I give it all as green vegetation for food. It almost looks here like he gives the vegetation itself, the leaves and the roots and that kind of thing, to the animals. But to the humans, he gave us the fruit. And that bears out in the rest of the scriptures, because we find that the herbs, and you see that with cows that are eating grass and stuff, but humans don't eat grass. And many things that have leaves and roots are not really good for humans. There's too much nitrogen in spinach, even has too much nitrogen for even a baby. And that's why they take the nitrogen out of it when you get that Gerber food and you want to feed your baby spinach. You shouldn't just take regular spinach and cook it and give it to your baby. because there's too much nitrogen for a baby. A grown-up can handle it. A lot of roots. Now, some roots, like potatoes, they're so hybridized that they're probably pretty good for you. They're not like a stringent, bitter root that you might dig up somewhere. Because remember, the world now has gone to seed. It's been cursed. Produces thorns and thistles. And even Jesus said, we don't, figs, you don't get thorns, food from thorns or thistles. So, it's kind of gone to seed and it's gone to thorns, and there's not much food value anymore. So something happened. Probably after the flood, there's a scripture that says that at that point, this Yahweh gives them the ability to eat animals. Now, we're not certain about that, but that's what it appears. So in the Genesis creation, in the original creation, it does not appear that he ever allowed us to eat meat. But that verse there where it says, have dominion, that's the word, as we said, rada. We're going to find out what that word means here in a second. But it's not the word, even though it's translated have dominion, where it says that Eve shall be dominated by the man. That's a different word. That's masham. And that word means to literally to rule over and, sort of tyrannical rule. Because it was a curse. Well, this original thing that says have dominion over the fish of the sea, it's not a curse. And it doesn't mean to rule over in a ruthless way. And here's how we can show you what that word really means. If you look at, and I have to look this up, bear with me a second. I think it's one second. Trying to do this from memory, so look at Ezekiel chapter 34. It says, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy, and you must say to them, to the shepherds, this is what the Lord has said. Woe to the shepherds of Israel, who have become feeders of themselves. Is it not the flock that the shepherds ought to feed? The fat is what you eat, and with the wool you clothe your own selves. The plump animal is what you slaughter. The flock itself you don't feed. The sick ones you have not strengthened. The ailing ones you have not healed. The broken you have not bandaged. The ones dispersed you have not brought back. Those that are lost, you don't seek to find them. But with harshness, you have had them in subjection. You have ruled over them with tyranny. That word is the word that is used there in Genesis, where it says you will have dominion over the animals. But you see, he doesn't want us to have dominion in tyranny. He didn't intend for us to we see animals. In other words, what he was saying, the word has to do with the root. It means to go down, come down off a mountain and reign over your subjects. So it's like it's not like a tyrant, but as one of them, sort of a leader, a shepherd type of rule. Not a shepherd's not supposed to rule the sheep with tyrannical, death and murdering and judgments, and that's not what Genesis 1:26 is talking about. It's talking about shepherding them. And here, bandaging those that need help, going and looking for the strays. We're supposed to have dominion over the animals, not in the sense of murdering them, but in the sense of bandaging them, looking after them, and finding the ones that are lost. Jesus is the good shepherd, remember? And he doesn't come to murder or to rule over us. In fact, he says, you're my friends. I'm not even your master. You're not my servants. And that's how we're supposed to have leadership, not rulership. Leadership, not tyrannical rulership. So it's a different word than when Yahweh curses Adam and Eve, and the woman becomes tyrannically ruled over, and she's like, sit down and be quiet and wear a veil and that kind of thing. That definitely does mean that it was a tyrannical dominion, but and it's a different word. So how then, if we see this in the Bible, can we say then that we're supposed to eat meat? If we never were intended to eat meat, how is it we should recommend eating meat? Well, the simple answer is because the earth is cursed, and the thorns and thistles is what it grows. And I believe, beyond a doubt, that the nutritional value of these plants has dropped, because we know scientifically that there are certain things, and this is what we're going to get into in this video. There are certain things about eating and diet and nutrition that we're never taught. One is that some of the things that they're kind of promoting vegetarianism today, because they don't want you to kill the animals and breed cattle all over the world. They're saying it's making the earth warmer because cows are farting, and it's ridiculous. But I understand it in some ways because of the fact that the cruelty that's involved with the cows. They're hauling these cows long distances in the back of these trucks, and they're taking them into these slaughterhouses, and there's a lot of suffering going on, and that is something we should not tolerate. And so I do believe we should not eat meat that is where these like Monsanto and Cargill is a big company. They're related to Monsanto, owned by this mega corporation that owns the whole world, and they basically have bought up all the farms throughout America and around the world. Probably they've got a market on the seeds, a monopoly, and they've sewed up the market, and they have these huge plants, a lot of them in Texas and Ohio and Indiana and all throughout the Midwest. You'll go along, you'll see Cargill, and you just drive along the highway, you know what's going on in there. But you see trucks going in and out, and cows sticking their head out the truck, and it's sad when you find out what's really going on in there. But I've been through there. I've seen it. I've toured it. There was a time when a short time where a couple of years where I drove a truck, and I delivered the snacks and the sodas and the chips and stuff to these places. And I would have to go in some of these places where you needed to have some sort of credentials to get in there. You couldn't just walk in. A lot of the stuff they hide from you. But I was able to go in, and I watched some of the cruelty. And there were times where I probably almost lost my job, because one example, I walked into one place one time, it's a big dairy, and this guy had 2 baby calves in the back of his truck, and they were convulsing around in pain. And I thought, what's going on? Because why would a little cow be doing that? What happened? So I walked up, I ran over there, I said, what's wrong with these little calves? They were bleeding from the mouth, and they were convulsing around and stuff. And he said, oh, they got ran over. And I said, both of them? What happened? I said, you should put these, do something. Their calves are in pain. And he got a syringe out, and he did something with that, and I went back to work. But I probably could have gotten in trouble for objecting to some of this stuff. There was other times where I saw them go and pick up these calves by the legs and just throw them maybe 50, 60 feet into a wheelbarrow and haul them out. They'd jump out and they'd throw them back in. Sometimes they'd slam them down real hard, kind of as discipline or something. They didn't want them jumping out. And it was just so cruel. And There was one time I watched a huge cow that was so sick she couldn't stand up, and she was falling over. She was laying on her side. She couldn't get up. And they went over there and they kept kicking her. And I found out why they did that. I thought, what are they doing? What kind of cruelty? Why would they go beat that cow when it was so sick it couldn't stand up? And it turns out that it was illegal to use that cow for meat if it was already on the ground, if it couldn't stand up on its own. As long as the cow can stand up on its own, they were allowed to, I guess, shoot it in the head and butcher it, take it to market. And you would eat that cow. A sick cow, but it was walking, so you could still sell it to the market and make hamburgers out of it. But if that cow falls down at one of these dairies or these feeder lots or whatever, if the cow falls down and it can't get back up, then they're not allowed to use it as food. So whenever they get a cow that falls down, what they'll do is they have these forklifts and they go over there. If they can't, they'll kick it a bunch of times. If it won't get up, they'll bring a forklift. And I saw this, forklift has this very heavy iron sort of teeth in the front. And they went real, like 5 mile an hour, just boom, right underneath of him, ripping the cow all up, bruising his belly and everything like that. They weren't gentle at all. And it was gruesome, really. Trying to get this cow under the teeth of the forklift or whatever, and trying to lift the cow up. If they could get it to stand up for 5 minutes, I guess they could, use the cow still. And it was just terrible. I watched this many times, and I had some big arguments with some of the people that work there. And finally, I couldn't do it anymore, so I had to walk away. But I've seen and I've toured these places, and I don't even want to tell you the stories, because really I probably wouldn't be even allowed to tell you the stories about what I've seen in some of these things. Believe me, there's more. And I know most of you know what goes on. So anyway, that is so cruel and evil that we have to be careful that if we are going to eat meat, we should not participate in this system. We should not purchase meat that is treated like this. We shouldn't purchase the meat that is just labeled regular meat. And even some of the organic meat might not be any better. You have to make sure you find a place that sells meat where they treat their cows correctly. And I know that's hard to do. And there's a lot of other considerations. Some of the fish farms are terrible places to get your fish. But anyway, I digress. I don't really want to get into that part of it in this. I never intended for this video to have anything to do with talking about all this. But I do want to consider these points. However, if you don't eat meat at all, especially if you're a vegan and you don't eat eggs or milk, cheese, and that kind of thing, you can get very sick very fast, because there's just simply not proper nutrition in just vegetables and fruit. Now, look, even if you could eat the fruit of the trees, and even if there was proper nutrition, if you could get a good diet that way, you wouldn't be able to get a good diet by getting the kind of fruit and vegetables that you get from the store. I mean, I'm not just talking about the pesticides and the picking of it when they're picking it green, and the fact that the fields are being used over and over again, and they've leached all the minerals and nutrients out of the soil, and they're using certain chemicals to get them to grow bigger, and some of them are painted before you see them. They're putting paint on them, right? Or some kind of, there's some of the what they call genetically modified. A lot of us don't realize what that means. Some of us think, well, that just means that they're enhanced somehow, and genetically they're getting it put in a test tube, making it better. No. Most of the time, what that genetically modified means is that they're adding to the seeds. They're manipulating it by putting pesticides right in the genetic seed, in the DNA. Now, the reason they do that is that way they don't have to, the crops that they're growing aren't affected by bugs and things, because they don't have to put pesticides all over it. They just put the pesticide right in the food itself. See? So you're kind of eating a food that is crossbred with pesticides. And I mean, seriously, it's not good for you at all. And I'll tell you some reasons in this video why it's not good for you, other than just the fact it doesn't have nutrition. Some of the things that are in these foods that we're eating at the store, they literally block these neurotransmitters that we have in our body. See, I want to explain to you how our body works a little bit, so you can understand how we're so, why we're so upset and angry and emotionally dying and physically sick, and we got diabetes and all this stuff. But let me finish with this, because so first of all, you're going to eat bananas and apples and pears and peaches. These are the foods that are hybrids, some of which are genetically modified. All the corn is genetically modified, the soy, and certain kinds of food. And you'd have to have a list available to find out which ones. But then others, they don't call it genetically modified because they just spray some chemicals on it when it's growing in the field. And some of these chemicals literally affect the growth of the seed to the point where it's basically the same as genetically modified. Some of the watermelons are genetically modified, but others aren't technically genetically modified. In fact, I did a video on this a couple of years ago where I was exposing this about watermelons, and I got a phone call literally from the executive at the company, and they were going to sue me for millions of dollars if I didn't take the video down, because they said technically, well, they tried to tell me that they don't genetically modify their watermelons. And I argued with them on the phone, hung up on them, said I would do whatever I wanted to do. And then I realized that, well, I didn't really want a lawsuit. But while I was on the phone call with him, he said that they used chemicals, but they didn't. Anyway, I looked it up afterwards to get a little better understanding, and I found out what he was talking about. These huge watermelons, and they look all green and plump, and they seem so juicy and everything like that. They get them to turn out like that by spraying them with chemicals. So a lot of these, just about all the watermelons that you get that are these huge watermelons, they're not good for you. And this is true of a lot of the fruits and vegetables. But it's so much worse than that. We'll get into that in a second. So what I do when I go out into the nature, you notice that there's a lot of wild things growing. Usually when you taste something wild, it'll taste a little bitter or astringent. And so this is why a lot of people don't like, they think that it's all poison. We've been lied to about a lot of that. Not all the stuff that's growing in nature is poison. Very little of it. Mostly, the fruit is almost never poison. It's a little bitter, but that doesn't mean it's unedible. Like acorns are a little bitter, but the Native Americans ate them. Look, how about a bean? You wouldn't go and put a bean in your mouth. They taste bitter. You have to cook them and put a lot of salt in them before you can eat them. That's what you have to do with the acorns. And so many of the berries and beans and pods and seeds that you get in nature, they may taste a little bitter, but see, they were designed to cook, and you might have to add, and they can be very good. So if you prepare them right, they can be very good. But we have lost all the knowledge of how to eat the foods in the wild. Now, the reason why we should be eating wild foods that are already growing by themselves in nature, the paradise all around us, which is, gone to seed, but it's still there. And like I said, there's probably something that has happened. We don't know exactly, but this God, Yahweh, has cursed the ground. So we don't know if it's just completely, we don't know if it's saying that all the foods that we've been trained to eat are all bad foods, hybridized and so forth. And all we got to do is go back to nature and start eating wild foods. You hear about these superfoods from Brazil or Australia, right? You don't need to do that. You've got superfoods growing in your yard. Just the wild fruit. And the fruit. How about dandelion? Everybody's got that. Or daisies or thistle. You say, oh, I can't eat a thistle. That's thorns on that thing. Well, that's the thing. There is thorns and thistles and stuff on some of these things. But have you ever noticed that when you look at a thistle and you break the stem, there's some white sap coming out of it? Did you know that that white sap is almost identical to the sap or the white sap that you find in poppies? And it's very, very chemically identical. You can get higher than a kite. You can, when you take poppies, and poppies grow here, and you can go get poppies and grow them in your yard. I've actually I've heard that the little old ladies were taken to jail here in America because they had poppies in their yard or in their garden. They weren't smoking them. They were flowers, right? But you got poppies, that's heroin. Well, I don't know how often they take little old ladies to jail because of that, but it has been done. So I don't know, whether they consider just any poppy illegal or what. You'd have to look into that, but there is some indication that that's the case with at least some poppies. But the poppy has this little bulb where the flower is, and there's seeds as the flower late fall begins to drop off, and the pods, the seeds dry out. That sap turns to a dark brown color or dark black, and they take the seeds and they smoke them or whatever, and it's an opioid. But here's something interesting. We talked about this the other day. In your body, there are opioid receptors. Now, why would you suppose there is opioid receptors in your body? Because your body makes opioids. It's something that you need. Probably because we've been eating, not just, you have to understand, we think of poppies, but I just told you that thistles are very similar and have pretty much the same chemical nutrients in the sap of the thistle. And there's another plant called, what's it called? Wild lettuce. And I've seen it in New Mexico. It was growing in the park, just it's all over the grass, If they didn't mow the grass for a few days, it'd be growing up through the grass. And I remember one time I kind of busted the leaf and I was looking at the sap in that. And I actually ate a leaf just because I didn't know about it at the time, but I always eat wild plants. And I ate a kind of a mouthful. And by the time I got home, I was high. I mean, it was weird. I felt a little sick to my stomach, though, later, too. But, so, you have to be careful because, like I said, fruits are usually good. If they're a little bitter, then, you're not going to eat a lot of it because you don't like it. You'd have to process somewhere with salt or whatever. But leaves and roots, you got to be careful because there are a lot of ingredients, stringent and bitternesses. Anything bitter could be poison. If it's too bitter, you probably shouldn't eat it. And you should get a book and find out what you're picking in the woods and make sure it's good for you. But what I'm getting at is that your body, for thousands of years, mankind ate these particular foods, not just poppies. But mankind did eat poppies a lot. They used it, they were high on heroin for centuries, all the way back to Sumerian 3,500 BC. But besides that, remember, in the Chinese, and they have all these herbs and the ginkgo biloba and the gava and the cocoa plant and the caffeine plants and all these plants, cumin, turmeric that they eat. Turmeric has, I believe cannabinoids. It also has, it's either the cannabinoids in turmeric or it's the, I think it's the serotonin. But anyway, your body has receptors for cannabinoids too. Cannabinoid receptors. Now, some people think it's because we've been eating or partaking of cannabis for so many thousands of years that we've evolved that we need it. But you see, I don't necessarily think that's true. I mean, to some extent, yes. But I think that we've been eating food for thousands of years. And we have not been told what food is. All you've been told is that you need vitamin A, B, C, E, D, and G. Boom, you're done. What? Just, 5 vitamins? That's it? Oh, then they came out with some nutrients like they're called essential. A few things like fatty acids and things. Well, buddy, they haven't told you the half of it. You get lots of fatty acids. Now they're telling us that for a long time they told you not to eat fat, cholesterol. Well, if you don't eat cholesterol, you will die. But you won't just die, you'll die a slow, agonizing death. Because along with having the fact that you need certain plants that have this cannabinoid, that have this nutrient we call cannabis in it, and some foods that have opioids, and there's not just, like I said, not just poppies, there's lots of different plants that have the same ingredients. It's sort of common to a lot of different plants. There's different species that one whole walnuts are one of the best foods that have some of these. You can get serotonin from walnuts, and so if you look at the vegetables and the herbs in the world, we're not being told this. Some of them have serotonin. Some of them have dopamine, like ginkgo biloba, turmeric. Some of them have cannabinoids. Some of them have opioids. There are literally hundreds of different nutrients and chemicals that are in these plants that they're not cataloging very well for us. You may be able to go and read about it somewhere and find out if you could put it all together. But they tell you all the vitamins, but they don't tell you all these particular nutrients and chemicals, vital chemicals. And they don't tell you how imperative it is. For instance, if you don't get your cannabinoids, then you're going to be depressed. You're going to be maybe a loss of appetite or having too much appetite. You're going to be having troubles with association of people and feeling lonely or just a lot of sensory. Neurons are a way we sense the world. They're sort of sensory neurons. And there's thousands of neurons. But a lot of them, most of these things our body creates and makes within it. So they say, oh, well, you don't need to get it from food. But you see, they don't, or they'll say, well, you can't, if you eat that plant, it won't go into your brain, so you won't get high or you won't feel that well-being or anything like that. But what they're not telling you is that you have to have all these nutrients in your body somewhere in your gut. It starts with bacteria. You need natural food with bacteria. And you also need omega-3, because in our diet today, we're getting mostly omega-6. I think like 10 to 1. One part omega-3, and we're getting like 10 parts omega-6. And that's causing us to be sick, because the omega-3 is the cholesterol that is the every cell in your body is made out of it. And there's little receptors that it clings to, and transmitters that give you sensory perception, feelings of well-being, not just the ability to physically touch things and feel it, not just to be alive or to have blood pressure. Cannabinoids or opioids can control your blood pressure, stuff like that, but also your moods and your feelings. And so if you're eating chemicals, like sugar isn't even if sugar was a food, if you ate the white sugar that's processed, where it's white because they've soaked it in something, and it's been, all the nutrients have been extracted from it, and that is just now a chemical that's extracted from a plant. They took the sugar out of the peach or out of the sugar cane or the whatever they get it out of. So it's not a food, but it's just some chemical. And that chemical has been processed and bleached. It's not a whole food. It can do damage to you. It's kind of like doing heroin by itself. And you get an overdose of opioids, and then your body stops making the opioids that it's supposed to make, and it doesn't send the dopamine into the internal cortex, and you get very, very, very depressed. And we talked about that with these drugs that they're giving people, these mood-altering drugs, and how it's making people angry and violent, and they don't even know what they're doing. But by the same coin, they're also doing it with food. They're only giving us bananas, apples, peaches, and these are hybrids, and they're chemically sprayed all over the place, and sugar and white flour, which are blocking those receptors. So not only are you not getting these wild nutrients and foods, these superfoods, you're not getting the cannabinoids. You'd have to go get dandelions and ginkgo biloba and, all these different wild herbs that are growing all around your house. You don't need to go to China. You can get it in your backyard. So if you ate them, you'd get these vital nutrients, phytochemicals. They're mentioning them, they're talking about them, but they're not explaining what they are. And they really don't want you to know that cannabis is one of them. That eating the cannabis is probably the best way to actually have well-being. Just to get a real high isn't really always the best way. But what you need to do is have it in your system and break it down by chewing it. And then when you're eating the whole plant, you're getting a whole food, and it does things that just smoking it won't do. It gives you a whole body high, a whole relaxation, a whole well-being thing. But it isn't, just cannabis. We've got people running around smoking cannabis now, but they're completely ignoring all of these other local herbs that are growing right in your yard. Like I said, thistle and wild lettuce and dandelion. You can make a beautiful coffee or tea from the dandelion. So I think it's very important that we understand that along with these opioid receptors and cannabinoid receptors, we've got serotonin receptors. We got foods that have serotonin in it. We have dopamine receptors. We have so many different ones that we can't even cover all the different names and different things. There's hundreds of them. And they're all important to our well-being and happiness. So we got several things we got to look at here. We can't be eating things that block our receptors, like chemicals that bind, that fake our body out and bind to them and block it so that we feel numb and life becomes meaningless. We're walking around and thinking that we're just upset and angry. And we have every right to be. I mean, there's death and murder all around us, and the propaganda, and we may go into war and this and that and the other thing, and our mom is in jail, and all that is bad enough. You imagine what people have gone through? I just got through talking, I don't even want to tell you the discussion or the conversation I just had with somebody. The deep trouble that this world is in, and this suffering that people go through. It's just so profound. I literally can't understand how people could go through life with the troubles and problems that they have. It's amazing to me. But even so in order to be happy, we've got to know what we're eating. We've got to eat wild foods. We've got to get these vital nutrients, and we've got to stop eating the processed foods. But what about meat then? Why is it that we have to eat meat? But you can get all these vital nutrients from the plants. Why do we need meat? Well, these vital nutrients that bind to these receptors, what is the actual receptor itself? It's made from cholesterol. omega-3, which you can't get from plants. And I believe that's why Jesus specifically told us to eat fish. If you look at the book of Ezekiel, it tells about during the 1,000 years when God's kingdom will be established all around the earth, and the waters of the earth will be healed. And it says there will be the trees of life that will line the river of life. So that's important. During the God's kingdom, when it's restored and the curse is gone, those fruit trees are going to be producing the 12 manner of fruit. But it also mentions that there will be fishermen along the river. And the reason why I believe it says that, and I think that's why Jesus offered us fish, is because it's going to take time for the earth to be restored. In fact, during the 1,000 years, mankind still won't have immortal life, immortality. It says that the days of a child will be like an old man. In other words, you'll be 99 years old and you'll still be a child. But not forever. So it's going to take 1,000 years or more for the earth to really be restored back to its paradisical form. And so at this point, because of the ego and because of the problems, the world is cursed and we can't get the nutrition only out of the vegetables and fruits. Now, it doesn't say anything there in Ezekiel about along that river. It doesn't say anything about eating the lambs. In fact, that scripture I was just reading to you in Ezekiel chapter 34 says there will be a new covenant that will be made. Now, and I know you think you've already gone through the new covenant, but evidently there's another covenant, because this covenant shall be made with all creatures on the earth, not just with humans. If you read Ezekiel, it says he'll make a new covenant with the animals, and there'll be no more murdering of these little lambs. And yet, we'll still be eating the fish. I believe that for now, we're supposed to eat. I think we've had different timetables and different dispensations of time. And I think because of the fact that we were nomads for a long time, there was all these wars. We weren't supposed to be warring, but people lived in under the law, in the dispensation of the law, and they had to go by the law, and they didn't know anything more, and they went by war, and the ego ruled, and it was supreme. And people murdered one another in war, and they went by the law of Moses, which gave certain foods that were clean and unclean, and they ate lambs. But obviously there in Ezekiel, it's telling us that it wasn't correct. One day he's going to stop this murdering and this, and he's going to, show us again how to shepherd the sheep. But there's still going to be a period of time where we're going to be eating fish, and we're going to have to eat eggs, and we're going to have to drink the milk, the land of milk and honey, for a period of time. Because you see, there's certain omega-3 acids that are in milk and animal-based oil products that we have to have in order for nutrition and health. So I believe that at this time, it's not illegal or unlawful to eat any animal, as long as you're dealing with it justly and with compassion. You don't torture the animals. And I believe that we can't just live on vegetables at this time. If you were going to try to do that, I think you'd have to go out into the wild, because these chemical-based nutrients that are in these foods, these cannabinoids, the opioids, the serotonin receptors that are in some of these foods, the dopamine, and there's hundreds of these phytochemicals that give us well-being and health and help heal our bodies and keep us young, and only God knows what all these things are for. It helps heal our bodies. If you're not partaking of these nutrients, then you can't possibly be well. But at the same time, if you don't have the proper ratio, 1-to-1, omega-3, omega-6, and you have to have meat, the EPA and the DHE or the DEA, it's a type of oil that's found in animal-based products. You have to have that in order to have well-being, not just to physically, your brain's made out of this cholesterol. It's made out of this fatty acids. all your tissues, every cell. And it's this oil that is transformed into hormones. People have diabetes. I forgot the other day I was trying to figure that word insulin, which is a hormone. They don't produce it anymore, and then they have diabetes. Well, it's not that, we produce opioids, we produce cannabinoids, but if you're not eating correctly, you're not going to produce these things. And you're going to have certain things that block these receptors so that they can't bind. That's what's happening when people have insulin problems. So the simple answer to all of this is to understand that the earth, originally, we're going to live in paradise, and in the end, and the first will be last, the last will be first, and paradise shall be restored. But at the time that we're living in now, we're in the process of doing that. And so knowledge, as the Bible says, shall increase in the latter days. And through this knowledge, we're going to be able to interpret the ancient wisdom and find out where we've gone wrong. And I know that what we're going to find out is that there's some very important nutrients that we're missing. You're walking around and you think you're depressed and sad and you don't, there's no meaning to life and you don't know why you're here. And you don't even realize that it's not even, there's so much more going on than you've ever been told. You thought, well, I'm eating fruit and vegetables, I got some broccoli and I ate a banana, and that's not good enough. You must eat eggs. Do you know that eggs produce cannabinoids? Yeah. It's in the eggs because it's in the cholesterol, the omega-3. And you have to have it in order to... So if you are smoking cannabis and you're feeling that this is helping you, it will help you 10 times better if you get your eggs. Because it has to bind to the receptors to work. And if you're eating white sugar, it could be blocking the cannabinoids and therefore causing a lot of problems that way. So anyway, I see we're well over an hour now, and I really didn't even get to say half of what I wanted to say in this video. There's so much more. I think we'll do another video on this because there's a whole bunch more I want to tell you about this. Various plants that we should be eating, dandelions, what you can do with them, how you can go out in your backyard and pick this stuff. And you think, I got a lot of people will say, just real quickly, before I close here, I'll say, as an example, people just think this isn't really, just crazy. Like, what are you going to do? Go eat a thistle that's got stickers all over it, right? And how would you eat it anyway? And dandelions, yeah, they're growing, but I'm not going to go out there and pick them. I made tea with them one time, threw a dandelion in a pot of water and boiled it and tried to drink it, and it was terrible. Well, see, you're not doing it right. You take the roots, preferably the older roots that are about a year old, and you chop them up into little pieces and you roast them just like you do coffee beans. If you take green coffee beans and try to make tea out of them, it tastes like peanut juice. So when you roast them, you get that flavor. And that's what you do with the dandelion roots. And there's lots of other different things that you can use to make teas. And you can literally, you don't have to buy all this coffee and all, cocoa also has cannabinoids in it and stuff like that. That's why a lot of people like dark chocolate. But we have to learn what all these herbs and things are, what they do, and we have to start partaking of them. And when we go out into the wild, we need to find wild fruits and vegetables and bring them home and make soups and tinctures and teas, because the herbs are for the healing of the nations, friends. I'm going to go ahead and go. We'll see you again tomorrow. Have a good one, friends.